digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam special. This week we are joined once again by Charlie McDermott. We have with us Dave Cook, Jeff Gomez, Phil Harris, Thembisa Cochran and Kathleen Wallace. And this is the second edition of the VR Writers' Room. Why don't you all introduce yourselves individually and explain a little bit more about what you do? I'm going to start with you, Charlie.
Kia ora koutou. Hello, my name is Charlie McDermott. I'm a creative entrepreneur and the creator of an immersive theatre show called The Generation of Z.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dave, why don't you explain a little bit more about what you do?
Hi, I'm Dave Cook. I'm a digital account manager at marketing agency Digitas LBI, and I'm also the founder of comic creation group Card Shark Comics.
Wonderful. And Thembisa, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Hi, my name is Thembisa Cochran. I'm a film producer and writer, and also currently working as development executive for a feature film production company called Spear Film.
Wonderful. And Jeff, why don't you tell us more about you?
Hey there, I'm Jeff Gomez. I am the CEO of Starlight Runner Entertainment. We're a production company that specializes in extending entertainment properties and other kinds of messaging across multiple media platforms in concert. I'm personally responsible for having created story worlds like the Hot Wheels cartoon animation world, the Magic the Gathering fantasy universe, Turok Dinosaur Hunter video games, and Coca-Cola's Happiness Factory.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. And Kathleen, why don't you explain more about yourself?
Hi, I'm Kathleen Wallace, and I am a writer and performer and producer of theater and mobile video.
Thank you. And Phil, tell us more about what you do.
Hi, I'm Phil Harris. I'm a senior content developer for OneFun Mobile. I create worlds and narrative and stories within those worlds for a massive multiplayer online role-playing game, and I've worked on some other projects as well.
Wonderful. And I am your friendly host for this session. I'm Tanya, the founder of Digital Jam. Well, thank you very much for joining us, everybody. And this week's session is focused around what Jeff likes to call distant mountains and what the rest of us might refer to as creating universes in the specific context of VR. So I'm going to throw this one out to you, first of all, Jeff, just because I know that this is your pet thing that you're very, you have a, no pun intended, big vision on. Why don't you give us your context on what a distant mountain is in your world?
Well, sure, Tanya. Distant mountains actually is sort of a term coined by J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was often asked why he spent so much time crafting the world of Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings in such fantastic detail. Why are we getting into things like genealogies and various fictional languages and the origin of the gods of Middle-earth and how magic works and all the civilizations and sub-civilizations of this world? What does all that matter when we really are interested in whether or not this hobbit can get this ring to the cracks of doom, and for us to see a lot of cool action and wars and things like that? And Tolkien said, well, you know, when we move through this world, and it is pointed out that on those distant mountains, there are people, and they have beautiful cultures, and they care about nature, and they care about one another. And beyond those mountains, there are other peoples that have their own lives and are trying to get by, and they're beautiful too. Then it matters whether or not that ring gets tossed into the cracks of doom. We come to love this world and care about whether or not it survives. So in other words, Tolkien has crafted something that feels very real and feels as if it's alive and operating all around us. And to me, that's very much what the potential of VR is. We're immersed in these virtual worlds, and we're experiencing narrative. But what it can do really is kind of inform us that there is a fabulous world beyond the things that we can see right in front of us. And that makes us care, that triggers our passions and makes us want to move forward with this experience.
So I'm going to kind of go slightly left field on this, and I'm going to bring up that phrase that has been used in the past, which is ARG, alternate reality gaming. And I would question you in this way, Jeff, which is when we talk about creating these distant mountains, this distant universe, and creating the entirety of this ecosphere, this is often done within the context of the writing, but in the delivery of the universe, ARG is a modern way of delivering in multiple layers, in multiple platforms. And in many ways, what Charlie does, for example, with Generation of Z, is very much ARG in some of its delivery. Do we feel that VR is something that can be self-contained in that delivery of Distant Mountain? Or do we feel that it is another component that can be added into the existing format of ARG?
Well, when we think about some of our favorite pieces of individual media content, a really great movie, a really great novel, the creators of those things have fully realized those universes. We move through the various Harry Potter books and become absolutely convinced that this is a working, operating world. So, in my opinion, the notion of distant mountains and a fully realized universe, the medium is worthy of creating that just for that medium. So it doesn't have to be a transmedia experience in order to feel rich and real and deep. We can have that just in VR. Of course, I'm as big a fan of alternate reality games as anyone, and the various media help to contribute to that feeling of richness and immersion. But VR, I think, ups the game because, of course, it's almost tangible how it surrounds us and how we can move through it.
So, Phil, I know that you've obviously created quite a few different universes now, and you have that experience of creating that depth that Jeff is referring to. In the context of VR, when obviously there are two aspects to this. The first is the aspect of the written word and the verbal word and what the characters are saying within the narrative and within that moment. But then there is also the visual context within VR, where we have this 360-degree visual universe that we can see around us. But just because we can see the 360 around us doesn't necessarily give that depth. So I'm curious from your perspective how you see that evolving for VR.
It's really interesting that Jeff mentioned Tolkien because just to sort of follow on from that, I think Tolkien, because he has this world that's created, for me, all these types of projects, VR, video games, I control the canon of Celtic Heroes, I control the canon of Distant Star, Revenant Fleet, and the 10% of what you see in the world is not the 90% of the rest of the iceberg, which is below the ocean. And the reason that 90% needs to be there is because of engagement. It engages the people. If you look at a TV drama such as Fortitude, there are certain things in there where somebody breaks through a single glass pane rather than double glazing, and they're above the Arctic Circle and it's into somebody's house, and it's just like, no, that wouldn't happen, not in the modern day, not in a contemporary setting. It would all be double glazed to like keep the heat in and things like this. And so if you don't do your research, if you don't have like that engagement, then you lose the people, and you lose the people from the experience. That engagement's so important. So whatever the world is that's surrounding you in this virtual reality setting, you need to create acceptable rules for yourself when creating this experience. And the people will come to accept the terms of that experience. And to give an example, if at the very start of the experience there's a newspaper that they can pick up and they can read, it's always going to be a case that if they see another newspaper within the experience, they will expect to pick it up and read it. Because you've let them do it the first time. So you have to take all these aspects into account. And then thinking about that newspaper itself, even if it's not got anything, it's obviously got something major to do with the story you're telling, but it might have other stories that they can read on those pages. And if there's a time progression in the virtual reality experience you're thinking about, what happens when they pick up the next newspaper? Because they possibly might be more interested in another story they saw in the paper the first time. And how does that story continue? So you're looking at this vast array of things, and it's really important that when you're world building and you're narratively creating, when you're creating those distant mountains, you know what you want to mention in it, because there are thousands of different types of shoes in the world. But realistically, in the writing that I do, I'm not that bothered about shoes, because I don't think that people who are going to be engaging in the products that I make are going to be that interested in shoes. That's not what they're coming in for. But if you were doing a shoe wholesale virtual reality experience, then I'd expect shoes to be the thing that you knew most about.
I'm interested, Kathleen, from your perspective, as somebody who writes for theatre and as a playwright. Oftentimes, within the experience of theatre, obviously you only have that spotlight of the stage. And there is so much that happens sometimes beyond what we see as the audience on that stage. So I suppose in some ways you're already kind of utilising and addressing that idea of beyond this moment, beyond the distant mountain. How do you see that progressing for VR?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you go all the way back to the Greeks, they have the chorus, which will tell you everything that's happened off the stage. So you have to know everything that's happening all around the world so that it then informs what's happening on the stage. Part of what's interesting for me, though, about when we think about distant mountains with theater is in theater, in traditional theater, we have the proscenium and we have that fourth wall, which is now missing in VR. So you can have in theater a production that is very spare, and yet the audience, and it's in that spareness that the audience is invited in to use their own imagination, which gives them that sense of ownership, which is essentially what Jeff was talking about, or the way I understand what Jeff was talking about before, about caring about the universe. And so when you remove that proscenium, when you remove that fourth wall, then the audience's imagination has to be engaged in a different way. You have to have that continuity. You have to have that consistency so that it does become that real place to them, because it is so much more tangible than what they're allowed to create in their own imagination.
Do you think that that's something that you could get away with in the context of a VR environment? So, for example, I'm just remembering the experience of watching Dogville for the first time and feeling a little bit lost initially to start off with. And there's no sets, there's just, lines on the floor to indicate the walls of the room, etc. and so forth. Do you think that's something that potentially we can get away with in VR?
Keeping it very spare like that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, I haven't thought about it. I think it could happen. I think you would have to, ironically, really map out the world not that you don't have to do it in great detail if you have all of the experiential moments in VR. If you take all those experiential moments like the newspaper that we were talking about away, I think you have to be even more detailed because what is in that void?
Okay. So Charlie, from your perspective, obviously talking about immersive theatre, when you create something like the Generation of Z and you have these moments where there is reference to this broader disaster, I can't remember the entire storyline, the reasons why everybody's suddenly a zombie, but obviously you very much invest in this idea that you are in a moment within this universe. How do you see this progressing in a virtual reality environment? Or do you see this being something that can be integrated into VR or likewise something that can be taken and VR can be inserted into what you do?
Absolutely, yeah. So how we created this kind of 5 years ago was, and this was before I met the prophet Jeff Gomez when he came out to New Zealand, and I became a devoted disciple, is that I'd always said to the boys and my team of writers that, okay, we're setting this show a month after this outbreak has happened of a disease. And we always came back to if a disease really happened, if SARS had happened or any of these diseases that are out there, what would truly go on? So there's no point presenting this idea of a zombie apocalypse a month after the outbreak unless we go back 50 years and we go forward 50 years and we create a Bible. And so I'd been a massive stickler for this. And of course, then Jeff came out and it opened my entire eyes of going, we were already thinking there, but this is definitely where we should be thinking. So where we created our Transmedia project, if we look at it in a linear perspective of a 100-year cycle, the live iteration is a month after the outbreak, but the teen fiction novel is set 15 years on that timeline after that outbreak, even though you can access both pieces of content at the same time. Going backwards, we have a whole lot of video content and website and blogging done from characters who had been working on an anti-aging drug and had got very, very far in terms of their development of this anti-aging drug. And that's what then went into creating the zombie virus. So we have a whole lot of content based going backwards. Now, even though we have this mapped out, we're in the middle of creating all of these different transmediums at the moment with these different story pieces. How I would see that working with virtual reality is that I'm in an experience where I can access everything over that 100-year timescale. So non-linear in the sense that I get to choose where I can be, or I get to choose whether I can go back in time, or whether I can speak to characters who are the father of one of the characters who's in the live experience. But I would expect that eventually the technology and our thinking will be, I can have an experience that is 100 years long. Does that make sense? 100 years long.
It does make sense, but I have a question for you, Charlie.
Yes.
And that is, do you think that there is an argument to say that actually, when we're developing this content, we're developing the experience for the audience, that we as the narrators and we as the storytellers might actually want to gate that content, and therefore, actually, yes, there is 100 years worth of experience that you could have, but you know what, we're only going to give you 25 years. And then maybe when you progress, or you complete this time when we've done the rest of the development, you'll get the next 25 years. But that idea that you can know that there is that broader scope of the universe, but you're only going to deliver a certain chunk of it at a certain time. Do you think that's something plausible, or do you think it is a necessity to give them the entirety of the world to play with right from the word go?
No, I don't think it's a necessity. And I think if you, as a producer, and you're saying, look, we want to hook it's like having a sequel. You know, I want to hook our audience in, and then we want to bring them back. I guess I'm just taking the Tolkien example is brilliant, and Harry Potter example is brilliant, that those worlds and those side books exist, and on the internet, the entire universe exists, even though I might only go and pick up the Fellowship of the Ring. If I enjoy that, I can then access a huge, huge universe around that. And I guess that with VR, even though I might be presenting them, say we took the live show a month after and I shot 12 different characters' points of view that you could choose going through this experience, I would hope that after that, the viewer could then access that universe within a virtual environment if they chose to do so. And that's specific to my project, to this current project. However, you're right. I think if you've got a project that is more secretive, or not more secretive, but you're holding things back. Now, the writers need to understand it, but sometimes you don't want to give everything to the audience in one shot. So I think you would hold it back in that sense. But there's scope for both, definitely. I think as we move on, though, we're going to get, and as the technology moves through this VR period and obviously then into AR, everything's going to be at our fingertips and around us at all times. So we need to be very, very careful and clear within each IP universe we're creating of what our outcomes for that new Play-Doh is.
I like that, the idea of virtual Play-Doh.
Tanya, can I just this is Jeff, on something that Charlie mentioned, which I think is really important for us to understand about distant mountains. It's easy to think about distant mountains as something geeky, as the thing that people with OCD kind of create so that there's enormous amounts of detail. In what Charlie just told us, something emerged, which is that theme, what it is that you have to say as a creator, ought to dictate your distant mountains, okay? So look at the three phases of Charlie's Generation Z world. We have the one that's set in the past, which was the pursuit of immortality. We have the present, the actual live experience in which we're grappling with the undead, who are effectively immortals. And then in the future, we are struggling for the mortality of the human race. We're just trying to be alive. When you look at it that way, the intellectual property has something to say that distinguishes it from The Walking Dead or all these other different zombie properties. And what it has to say informs those distant mountains, informs the past, present, and future of the property, enabling Charlie to create compelling content that feels of a piece with itself, that feels like a continuum, even though we are enjoying it in many different ways. And that's a lesson for us all to take about distant mountains. It's not just about generating huge amounts of detail about our worlds. It's that these details help us to fully describe what it is we have to say in our story.
Thank you, Sensei.
There's a lot of bromance going on here at this moment in time. But Kathleen, you have something to add.
Yeah, I think there's something very telling about the fact that we call this medium virtual reality. The reality is baked in. And if we think about our own reality, then it's not just something we do for the geekiness of it. And it's not just something we don't just skate over the surface of it. we can imagine what's hidden under our couch. We know what's in the cabinets in our bathrooms. That is our reality. And so if we are going to embrace the nature of this medium, which again, baked in is that reality, then we have to take on the responsibility of actually creating reality.
Interesting. Dave, I'm going to come to you because from your perspective, in this comic universe that you exist within, there's oftentimes, I say this from the various comics that I've worked with and various properties I've worked with, there's oftentimes a heck of a lot more history there and a lot more to be said than you ever see in the comic. The comic is normally a very thin slice of what is a much more complex universe, much more complex story, and often very complex politics even involved in these comic universes that we explore. And I think that's a lot of what gives so many writers today so much opportunity with comic universes and the exploration of comic universes in different formats, whether that's as movies or TV shows or whatever it may be. But from your perspective, Dave, this idea that the comic format and the comic medium offers a portal into these vast universes that we really don't see a huge amount of. We only see a very small facet through the comic. What would be your take on this?
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the interesting things is that when obviously writing a comic, one of the big things you need to get to grips with early in your career is that you're not just writing dialogue, you are in effect director. When laying out a script, you must say, okay, in this panel, we see the two characters standing face to face and they say this. That's not enough. Of course, you need to establish what's in the background, visual cues that just give a broader understanding of this world. It could be something very simple like a propaganda poster on a wall in the background that tells you there may be some sort of regime controlling the world. Or, for example, a really good comic that is a great example of what you described is Tokyo Ghost by Rick Remender. And this is set in a world where it's futuristic. It's set in a new version of Los Angeles, which has all become like a sort of tech-heavy metropolis where people are always jacked into the internet via their optic implants. So there's always a screen hovering in front of their faces, and they've become addicts. You know, they've been addicted to things like reality TV show, to violence, to gore porn, this kind of thing. And there's so many wonderful cityscapes in this comic, you know, big centerfolds, big double page spreads of these great backdrops where there's crowds of people watching TV, there's posters, there's people hanging out outside bars, destruction derby going on in the background. And it's one of these things you can actually like feel the environment leaping off the page. And a lot of comics don't do this well. This is an example of one that does do it well. And it's an interesting thing within those cityscapes and those scenes and those visual representations of worlds. You really do have to set out rules because it can be quite easy to break continuities, I'm sure we're all aware of. And it's interesting because I've read comics where, for example, a character is in a locked room and they're trapped, but then a few issues ago, we established they're very good at picking locks. These kind of things don't make any sense. And then in my most recent comic, Bust 2, I actually ditched boxes, so voiceover boxes, you know, those boxes that say meanwhile or give a location name. And these were all made into visual cues. And I just think things like boxes risk breaking immersion in those worlds. So for example, there's a scene in a bar which takes place sometime after the previous scene. And it's a kind of rough bar. There's lots of like drunks and hoodlums. And to really get across that this is a dangerous place, you know, you have to drop in, you know, people fist fighting in the background. And instead of a box, there is a knife sticking in the wooden table and someone's carved sometime later into the wood. So it's not, and this is basically the motif for the whole issue is I wanted, so the first issue is very much a prologue to the rest of the arc. So there was a lot of voiceover, a lot of storytelling. There was a lot of world building and visuals too, but I thought, okay, there's a lot of jumping around in time. My second issue of that arc takes place pretty much in real time, as it were. It's all dialogue. There's no voiceover. You don't get inside the characters' heads through quick exposition. You know, it's something, it could be the subtle way their expression is changed or the way their body language is. There's more ways to do this than straight up dialogue in comics. But I think you're right, though. Some comics, I think, have a harder time of it. They have a harder time selling their world, their reality. I think it's something that you'll see certainly in the small press. There's a huge wide range of stories that you wouldn't see from the big two, Marvel and DC, because they're quite averse to risk these days, but obviously being quite a big business, they have quite a dominance over comics. But I think when it comes to their universe building, they do have to be conservative to a degree because those characters are so cherished and they're so, certain things are expected of them. Captain America, for example, is always quite stoic, and so they can't take a lot of risks. Now, I think if you want to get really good examples of universe building, I would definitely recommend anyone to check out Image comics because they are all creator-owned indie sensibility comics, and they cover such a wide range of topics, and they're a really good go-to for great examples of universe building. Such imagination there. And I also wanted to pick up something that Charlie mentioned earlier about, I believe we touched upon the episodic approach, giving people a chunk of a narrative and then letting them play through it or absorb it before giving them the next. And what's interesting, I think, from a VR standpoint is obviously we are creating these really tactile worlds that we get even more immersed in. And using the Distant Mountain example, it might be what I would like to see some sort of VR filmmaker tackle is different perspectives on narrative. So rather than make things episodic, why not let the user experience the narrative from the perspective of, say, 5 different characters? So you get a brand new take on one event, for example, depending on these people's different backgrounds, their perspective, where they may be. And I think it'd be really interesting to see someone in the VR space tackle that. Just giving different perspectives on a singular event from different personas. I think that's quite interesting. Certainly, I know video games have done that with some good effect as well. I've never seen comics do that, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's one way you could tackle it because we all have different views of the world.
Absolutely. Tambisa, I'm curious to hear from you, from your perspective in terms of from the film perspective, what your take is on this Distant Mountain.
Actually, it turns out I have a lot to say, and not just from the feature film side of things, but also because as a person, I do a lot of pen and paper role playing, which is basically generating a story live with a bunch of people around a table. And I think it's very weird to be sitting between those two things because on the one hand, in a role playing scenario, you kind of create the world as you go. So the mountains are created as you look at them and go, what's that over there? And in the feature film side of things, everything is so incredibly controlled. I actually think, despite the fact that there may be an impression that feature film or that kind of narrative filmmaking is relatively close to VR, it's actually really far because if you think about the key players in a feature film, they are your director and your editor in many ways, and the writer who maps it all out very precisely in the beginning. So you have a very, very, very controlled, very tight world, actually, where if you turn your camera a few degrees to the left, you'll see that you're not in Spain, but somewhere in South Africa, for example. And that's not going to fly in VR. So, your editing often saves the day. You can completely change a film from the moment it's kind of reached the edit suite to the moment you see it on screen, which, again, you are not going to be able to do with VR. So I think for filmmakers, VR is actually a massive challenge in many ways. I know some filmmakers already do keep on rolling, do very long takes. So that has some similarities, but it's more like feature filmmaking now because I know filmmaking encompasses a lot of things, but feature filmmaking is a very precise, very economic form, actually, like a poem where you've cut out everything that you don't need, absolutely everything, to try and make a point through a very, very small lens. And VR is like the opposite. You're not cutting anything out. And so I think is really interesting for me and what I really struggle with, and I'm trying to listen to everyone here and see what the insights are, is when you are providing people with this huge world, with all this detail, and if you want to create, you have to do a lot of that creation in advance. How do you guide your audience through it and not overwhelm them? Like, how do you control that? I know that's a slightly different story from the Distant Mountain story, but it's a massive challenge.
It's a relevant question there. And I think, Jeff, I'm going to kind of hurl this one at you because I know you're itching to say something. But what I would say is that what you have here is an overload, a sensory overload, if you like, in the context of VR. It's very much like, putting a child who's never seen sunlight, into the sunlight and saying, go for it. Explore this world that you really are. Without sunglasses, you're stumbling around a little bit in the dark, even though you're brightly in the sunlight. And so from that perspective, I do think that there are a number of different methods that can be applied in the context of VR to allow for a director and a writer to guide the audience. But at the same time, I think part of the joy of the medium is very much the fact that you can explore it as you see fit. So I'm interested to hear your point of view on this, Jeff.
Well, again, it's great that we're bringing Distant Mountains right to the threshold of what exactly VR is. And what that is it's a heightened sensory experience. So perhaps unique in any medium is VR's capability of stimulating many of our senses, possibly in the future even all of our senses, not in the way that we would if we were running around in the woods and engaging in some kind of role play, but with the kind of control that can be asserted in an environment that is being dominated by technology. So what we hear, what we smell even, or perhaps a touch when it comes to technology like haptics, is something that, again, is an extension of the communication of the storyteller, is thematically rooted in the cosmology and direction of the narrative that is unfolding around us. To me, that is fascinating because it enables artists to think about the creation of experiences in ways that we've never been able to accomplish before.
So I have a question to kind of follow on from. And I suppose from my perspective, one of the things that I see a lot of is people who create interesting experiences in the moment. So for example, you're talking about haptics, and one of the neat things that I've seen lately with haptics was this one where you lay on a board and there's like little wings and you can push against the wings and it controls your flight, and you're actually a bird and there's a fan and it's blowing air at you and you feel like you're flying through the city, and that's wonderful. But where is the narrative point in such an experience is my question. And so I suppose what I'm getting to is how do you as a writer create a narratively interesting and empathetic experience in VR versus these very tactile moments that people are creating, these immersive instant moments that don't really tell a story, that don't really actually give us any narrative?
So is it a question of how do you actually marry the two? Then I think a degree of signposting is probably required. And I wonder if that kind of dilutes our Distant Mountain, this freedom to explore a world without shackles. I wonder if an element of control is needed. So, for example, characters walking down a corridor and they're supposed to meet a character at the end of the corridor who will say something that will trigger, say, for example, a next scene, or will open a door at the end of the corridor to let them through into the next area. That, to me, has to be controlled. There's no other way to do that because, and games are guilty of this a lot, a character will stop and turn to the player and start saying something, but if it's an open world game, you can just keep on running and miss an important part of the dialogue. And I think game narratives can often fail in that regard. I mean, a classic one is Call of Duty, where that game is so funneled and you have very little control over the story. You basically are on rails. A character can turn and start giving exposition and you could miss it because you've outrun them and you're shooting the next wave of bad guys. So I don't know, is it a sacrifice where we do have to relinquish some of that freedom to have an element of control to create these set pieces, these scripted moments? Or, is there a new way to signpost and rein that in that we haven't considered yet? It's an interesting one.
Tanya, this is Jeff. It's important to understand that right now with VR, we're at Pong.
I thought we were even earlier than that, but okay.
So there's a long, long journey from Pac-Man to The Last of Us. And so you can bet that at arcades in the next couple of years, we're going to be able to fling ourselves on those boards and flap those wings. And the gimmick of that is going to be pretty compelling and enjoyable. But then it's going to be up to writers and fabulous producers to be able to take those basic tool elements and integrate them into compelling narrative experiences.
But I also want to build on what Dave was saying, which is actually my question in response to Dave is this, which is, yes, there may be a need to come up with an alternative way to gatekeep the experience in order to drive and funnel people through that experience. But on the other hand, it's kind of like the classic game, conflict, which is, do you want a sandbox game or do you want a narratively driven game? Do you want it to be a process that they have to go through, or do you just want to give them a universe and let them run wild and if they stumble on something, they stumble on it? Is there perhaps a degree of the illusion of perception that we want to give this audience, that they have the perception of sandbox, but the reality of narratively being driven?
That's a little bit mind-blowing, that, actually. It's interesting because you have games like Proteus and Gone Home where you can actually miss a huge chunk of the narrative if you go to point A to point, Z without hitting all the other letters along the way. It's as long or as short as an experience as you want it to be. And of course, as deep. I mean, do you want to read all the notes scattered around the house in Gone Home, or do you want to just get on with the story? So giving people the freedom, I think, is really powerful because no two people will have this exact same experience, and that in itself is great because games like Fallout, for example, again, like I could speak to any number of my friends who have completed that game and say, what did you do when you were faced with this dilemma? And they will all have a different answer for me, and that is so powerful. But you lose that if you control the experience too much, so balance is definitely needed. But I'm interested in this new way of doing it that you've proposed. I can't think of it right now, but it's really compelling.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say, I think that, as also someone who plays games, when you're running around a game that's too open, you do run the risk of getting bored because you can't see the signposts. So right now, I think it's probably up to us as our audience engages to find ways to teach them how things will be signposted in VR, because your audience will probably actively be a part of following those signposts. They'll probably buy into it and want to, because they'll know that if they don't follow it, it's going to be a long, boring time reading all the newspapers lying around.
Absolutely. Kathleen?
Something that Dave said got me thinking about a play by Brian Friel called Faith Healer, which is one story told by 3 people in 4 installments. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially like mosaic storytelling, where every time you get a new version of the story, you get a little bit more information. Mm. But just like Thempisa was talking about with the feature film having to be so, you edit away until you get this laser focus on where you're moving, because you have to do that. There, even with Faith Healer, with plays like this, you have to do the same thing. So maybe there's this way of having in this open world something that is so, where you edit down and get very laser focused on what are the points that we need to get across. Mm. And so that you do end up knowing where those guideposts are for your audience. So they create their own mosaic of the story. Mm.
There's somebody who has a project at the moment that's in development, so I won't talk too much about it, but suffice to say that the kind of theme is this idea that there is a blind person who exists in a world, and that world for them is this beautiful garden and this home that they live in, and everything about that world is infinitely and finitely their world. It is their universe. But in reality, this person lives in, like a warehouse, an empty warehouse room, and it's artificial flowers and it's a heat lamp that's actually the sun, and, all these things that actually the reality of what that person is experiencing is nowhere near the world they've created in their mind, because they don't know any better. And not that I want to impugn anybody who's going to experience VR for the first time, but hypothetically, they're not going to know any better. So is it our responsibility as the writer, as the creator, to define the world for them and to provide that guidance, and, to be the parent and say, what, if you go over that edge of that barrier right there, you will fall into the abyss, which you will never come back from. Is that what we're doing here, is creating that parental guidance, if you like, in the context of VR? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Rob, because I know that you were trying to say something earlier.
I think it's absolutely essential. I think we're possibly running scared from something, and we shouldn't be scared about it. Talking about the haptic experiences, and like, if you're a bird, if you just let the person who's engaging in the virtual reality experience initially just be that bird, and then have certain like trigger points within this world where stories start to evolve. So if they're really interested in flying down alleys, then something happens in the alley so that they engage with that. Or if they see something else, if they like to fly through the clouds, then something's there in the clouds. And so they lead the experience. They lead what's going to happen. And all you have to do is have like 7 or 8 different experiences in there, which get slowly like deeper. And the person taking part in the virtual reality experience will suddenly like realize, they'll understand that it's a carrot and stick thing, that you're giving them reward for what they're actually achieving. And so as they slowly achieve this thing, although that seems like a very game term, I don't really mean it as a game at all. I think it's just this experience of being able to flow from one adventure to another, just seeing what's out there. A very, very early game, Elite, which had a very successful remake. Elite allowed you to pilot a ship, but it was up to the person's imagination to write their own story. They were creating their narrative. They were the captain of this ship. That's what was important to them. But that didn't mean that the world that was around them wasn't rich with places to trade and sort of police and aliens. I think this experience is there. I think you've got to allow the person who's like taking part in the virtual reality experience to lead in a certain way, and to allow them to that freedom to go and explore and go off and do these things and feel a little bit heroic. So feel a little bit like they're the people who can initiate the change. Because if they feel that they're the person that can initiate the change, they feel that they're the person who can initiate the change, they're going to love it, because people like that of playing God effectively within this world that you create.
So, Charlie, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, because from an immersive theatre perspective, obviously you give people a certain degree of leeway. Like when they first enter a new room, there is a lot that they can explore. You know, if they want to pick up the bottle and look inside it, they can. If they want to shuffle those papers and read what's on the papers, they can. But ultimately, at some point in time, the actors are going to kick in and control this experience and guide them through a chunk of narrative, and then ultimately get them the heck out of that room so that you can move the next group in. So I'm curious from your perspective what your take on this is in terms of that degree of audience control, if you like.
Yeah, so we had many fights about how free roam we should make parts of the experience, especially when the audience, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, is very well educated by Punch Drunk, which is all free roam, and sort of the narrative for me was quite either non-existent, or you could pick up bits of narrative if you went deeper and followed a specific character or a line of action. Whereas for 90% of the audience, they are used to having a 2D experience where the narrative is delivered for them, but they do like roaming around and picking things up and finding little notes and having the interactivity of them creating their own experience within it. So our point of difference within this immersive theatre genre was to be a Hollywood beginning, middle, and end, and always have the structure of that. And also our device of delivering that narrative was the actors who can grab you by the scruff of the neck and drag you through this experience. But as we kept going, we thought, well, why don't we, when they first turn up, there's 25 minutes, let them free roam for a bit. Let's build up that tension by going, well, what's going to happen? What's going on? I'm in this dark room. Nothing's going, oh, I'm in a cage. And then boom, in come the guns and explosions and all of that stuff. And that really, there's nothing like a loaded firing weapon, not a real one, of course, but a blank firing weapon to really grab the attention. And I would bring this into the VR perspective where sound is, and we'll get into this in the technique discussion next week, but sound is our friend. You know, yes, if I'm watching Reservoir Dogs, the virtual experience, and they're all inside with guns pointed to each other, but I've wandered outside and I'm looking below the windowsill, I need to know what's going on inside for the narrative to get my attention back. And sound is our biggest ally in doing that, especially in a virtual sense. We don't have lighting. We're roaming around on our own. We're making the decisions. Remember, the audience is telling the story in VR, not the editor or the director or the actors, the audience is. So we need to use other techniques to get their attention back onto the narrative. It's almost like having a giant game master who's looking at all these players, and that would end up being a software, I'd imagine, which is a little bit of AI or algorithms that are monitoring what's going on with the person in the experience to pull them back into the narrative. But it is a balance. And for me, in terms of a gaming example, The Last of Us hits the perfect balance between me getting back on the story and then having a platform exploration through the gameplay. And if I could have VR film that was similar to that, I'd be a happy man. But that's just me. I think we need to do a lot more talking and research on the audiences themselves. And that 90% of people are sheep, if you know what I mean. They like to follow and just go along and happily have that experience. But there are 10% that will immediately go, if they can't affect the outcome of the narrative or if they can't interact, it's not for them. So we either have to make a decision that we go one way or another based on the specific project, or we have to find a way or a language that can encompass all. And that will, we are at the pong, like Jeff says, and these will be the trial and error from this point forward of how we answer that question.
It's the moment for me to jump in. I just wanted to kind of pose a question because it sounds like everyone is currently talking about it as something that is a lot like a peep show viewing experience. So where you are in the skin of the camera and you are like in a gaming experience, you are able to interact with the world. You are able to pick up the newspaper and everything. Whereas cinema is classically a voyeur experience where you are not obviously able to interact when you're watching a film. So you are living the entire film through your protagonist who becomes kind of your proxy for being able to experience the film and the film world. And I think a lot of the time people actually specifically love and watch cinema because it allows them to be in someone else's skin for a while. So they want to be Brad Pitt, for a movie, and they want to actually have people respond. But then also part of that experience is being able to see the person that you are. So you are not always in the first person perspective. And the question is that something that we need to give up if we're going to be filmmakers moving into VR? Or do you think there's some way to have a VR experience in which you are just a voyeur?
I tend to think that it's quite possible to have that voyeur experience in as much as just because the director's view has been removed doesn't stop you from just being able to sit back and allow things to happen in front of you and to watch those things happening and not necessarily interact with those things, but to just follow behind, like a quiet person in the back of a crowd just watching as the crowd moves forward. So I do think that it's still possible to maintain that architecture and that structure, but I open that question to the group.
There's a good example of, I think what you mentioned in there is just before the release of Star Wars, The Force Awakens on Facebook, there was a virtual experience which was Sandspeeder going through the deserts of the planet Jakku.
Let's be really, really clear. It was a 360 film. Just to be really clear.
But that of course, that was technically on rails. But you could still have a unique experience by looking around and catching different bits of the scenery whizzing by, and that was still on rails, but it was still really compelling. Actually, it was very interesting that it's now becoming a bit more popular. We see other people doing this, and I think that's the sort of voyeur experience. And yeah, I think that it's massively valid that you could have a sort of on rails experience like that, and depending on where you're looking at any one time, you may have a completely different experience from the person next to you. I don't think we lose, I wouldn't underestimate the power of that. Certainly interactivity is good, but yeah, I mean, if we can all glean something completely different from an experience like that, I'm sure.
It's actually interesting because I was actually about to bring up this kind of divide between certain people who are looking at VR and the context of VR. And there are two ends of this spectrum right now, and that the two ends are 360 film and what people would term as true VR. I'm using inverted commas here, my little finger's going, because there is this notion that if it is not something that you control the environment, therefore you're not able to plug in a controller and move about left and right and up and down and all the rest of it and actually be able to control what you as the viewer are seeing in the experience, then it's not what they would call necessarily true VR. On the other hand, there is this other end of the spectrum where really, quite frankly, there's not a huge amount you can have control over other than the direction that you are going to look in a 360 film or a 360 video. And yet, for the vast majority of the mainstream public who are not really clued up and not really engaging yet with this technology and with these experiences, their first experience of VR in any form will be 360. And so I suppose, Jeff, I'm going to throw this question back at you because we've talked about this notion of control, and I think actually the argument between 360 and true VR is a perfect example of that discussion about actually the degree of control that the audience has within the context of VR actually defines the type of VR experience it is. I put that to you as a proposition.
Well, I mean, it's really going to be a matter of technological development. What you're talking about are shades of mastery that we as producers have over the experience, the control that's going to be given to the participant, which is what I call the audience, the better you're going to have to be at affecting the ability for that person to affect some kind of change. And when you're talking about narratives as they become more and more complex, those changes are going to have ramifications to many different aspects of the unfolding experience, the butterfly effect, so to speak. So we're going to see a little of that right away, and the equivalent of playing with toys in a room. But we're going to have to get a whole lot better at figuring out the technology and writing for the technology in order for a true feeling of control to be had by the participant on the narrative.
So, just in closing, because I realise that we've kind of come quite off topic in terms of the distant mountains where we originally started. We've meandered through the entire universe and we're back at mountains. And I suppose the question that I would like to put to the group is this, which is, in the context of VR, and I suppose, Dave, this is kind of relevant for you in as much as with comics, we can have those visual markers. You can have those visual indicators of aspects that help to layer and build this idea of the distant mountain, so to speak. Do we think that within VR that it's going to be as important to have visual narrative of that distant universe, that distant mountain, as it is to necessarily articulate it in the spoken word, in the verbal narrative that we're hearing from the actors or the characters that we're interacting with?
I think it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell, though, and the kind of world you're setting it in, because ambiguity can still be powerful as well. But if we are talking about rich world building, I think visual cues alone, certainly in comics, it can often be enough. There's some things that don't actually need to be explicitly said, but if they're picked up by the reader or the viewer, what have you, that can be almost like a bonus for them. They've noticed something that maybe some people might have glazed over. It just adds a bit extra. If it's 100% critical to the story that you establish something, then yes, you have to make it really, really clear. But, if there's little, I guess it's what we say when we talk about things like the Star Wars novels, you don't have to read them to get the full story. But, if you do want a little bit more context, then that's interesting. I think like smaller visual cues like that can be compared to those novels. So I guess it just depends how much you basically want to build a world. Do you want it to be deliberately ambiguous, or do you want to make it scalable? Do you pepper little visual cues alongside the big, really important narrative driving ones? I think it's scalable, but yeah, I think it's definitely achievable. Is it important? No, I guess it just depends on the kind of story we're trying to tell.
So, in closing, one last question for you all. In this scope of universe building within VR, I'd like to hear from each of you, given the context of the industry that you work within, what you feel is the most important aspect of creating that sense of vastness, that sense of universe within the context of a VR experience. And I'm going to start with you, Kathleen.
That's because you just saw me turn my head to the side to really take a moment to think. I guess off the top of my head, I would say it has to come back down to that loss of proscenium, where you have in theater that fourth wall. And when that fourth wall isn't there, because we know that it's just a flat. We know that behind the couch, you can see the tape and all those different things. So that level of, again, you have to know what's underneath the couch. And even if the audience never goes to look underneath the couch, you have to be very clear for yourself on what's there. And whether or not you choose to do the bare room, kind of allow the imagination to take over, you have to be absolutely crystal clear, particularly on the points that are most important to move your narrative forward.
Okay. And Dave, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's one of these things. I think when it comes to taking narrative forward, I kind of want to double back a little bit to what we were saying about signposting. I mean, it's a narrative control. I think a solid experience has to find a delicate balance between the two. I mean, I think yes, you can handhold again to a point, if it serves a proper narrative purpose. Perhaps the user will miss something very, very poignant and very important to the story if they're, again, looking the other way. But, if they're looking that way and suddenly you're wrenching them back into another, then that can totally break the immersion. So, again, I was really intrigued when you came up with a solution, proposed a potential solution. I'd love to see what that looks like. But, yeah, we're still at Pong. As we said, it's going to evolve from there. But I need some more time to think about that one. It's a bit of a cop-out, but yeah, sorry.
Phil, what about you?
I think the engagement thing is the most important thing. This fact that if you have the person engaged in your world, and you can do very, very brief sort of short tests to see if people are engaged in the experiences and see what they take out of the experiences, and then grow those experiences exponentially so that people can try different things, try bigger projects and slowly expand. And as these projects expand, slowly understand more about the psyche and the actual nature of virtual reality and how virtual reality works with the public, with your audience, with your viewer, however you want to put them. And make sure that that engagement isn't broken, because if that engagement is broken, if that immersion is broken, then you've lost the game.
Absolutely. Then Bisa, what's your thoughts on this?
I think I'm going to have quite controversial thoughts now after thinking about it. But actually, coming from a film background, I think my feeling would be that the important thing to do if you want to build a really coherent world that all hangs together is to really, really think about what doesn't need to be in there. So to make sure that you really think about what you can leave out. So maybe there is nothing under the couch in your VR world, but in reality, you've got a mouse under it. But in the VR world, the mouse would just be distracting and overwhelming and take you away from what you really want, which is, we've all got reality. This is virtual reality, and we're trying to get into something that we can cope with a little better, and something where everything actually does make sense and does hang together. So that would be my thinking at the moment.
So almost a simplification of the world. Yeah,
and in a way, without losing Tolkien's amazing stuff, but in a way, maybe Tolkien's world is so engaging because it's all filtered through his head, and he's one man. And so in a way, it is simpler than reality as well. And so I think your Dogville idea that you mentioned earlier is really interesting. I really think that could work. It could work really, really well in VR, because I think what happens, as Kathleen was saying earlier, is that the audience's imagination engages at that point. When they don't have that much to go with, they actually bring their own imagination to the table. And that does make your world bigger, but you have to allow for enough doors for the audience to bring their imagination. So you need to obviously have enough in there that they can bring additional detail themselves.
Okay. Jeff, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, to build on what Thembisa just said, I think more than any other medium, we ought to think of virtual reality as a manifestation of dream. After all, when we dream, we are within a kind of virtual world. And a rule of thumb for the creation of distant mountains, for the creation of the environment that we're moving through in virtual reality, we can take a cue from dreams in that what we're seeing ought to be a projection of the persona of the protagonist, of the person moving through the environment, whether that is ourselves because we are actually moving through this environment, or whether it's someone that we are near or are watching and so forth. So your cue for the creation of distant mountains is what we're seeing thematically connected with what we're saying about this person, or what is going on within this person. Whether the mouse is there or not largely depends on whether there is an aspect of this person that is in effect projecting that mouse and is manifesting that symbol, and that symbol is a part of what needs to be stated within the context of this narrative. So virtual realities immerse us in these cosmologies. Cosmologies are only really meaningful if they are projections of ourselves. And that to me makes this medium kind of beautiful.
And kind of frightening as well. And we all seem to be obsessing about mice and newspapers and Pong. So, Charlie, would you care to have the last word that does not involve mice, newspapers, or Pong?
Sure. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with everyone. And the only point I'd add is before we get into what we're choosing to put in the VR medium, and it is a storyteller's medium, I would say that build the Bible, build the universe, build those distant mountains. So you as the writer, as the storyteller, understand and have that depth, but then you can choose what you want to relay to your audience.
Absolutely. Sound advice, Charlie. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this VR Writers Room. As always, we'd like to ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our listeners can follow you and find out a little bit more about what you're up to. And I'll start with you, Thembisa.
Yeah, so that's at THEMBISA, which is Thembisa.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dave?
It's Dave S. Cook, and that's Cook without an E.
Thank you. And Phil?
It's at Philip G. Harris, and that's Philip with one L.
Wonderful. Kathleen?
At Kathleen Wallace.
Nice and straightforward. And Charlie?
You can find me on Facebook, Charlie McDermott, Auckland.
Thank you. And Jeff?
Hey, that's Jeff Gomez on Facebook and at Jeff_Gomez on Twitter. Remember the underscore? The other Jeff Gomez gets really pissed off with me.
Remember the underscore, people. And of course, if you enjoy this content and you would like to hear more, don't forget to subscribe and review. And do follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thank you very much once again for listening, and thank you for joining us on this Digital Jam session. DigitalJamSessions.com